Your outdated farming practices and empty bank account have no place at a premium property auction. The cruel words hung in the air as 72-year-old Harold Jenkins stood frozen in humiliation, clutching his worn leather journal filled with handwritten maps of the underground springs. But when 3 black SUVs with government plates roared into the parking lot 90 minutes later, Richard Blackwell's smug expression dissolved as the distinguished woman who emerged introduced herself. "I'm Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, State Environmental Director and Harold Jenkins' daughter. Before we proceed with selling heritage farmland over a protected aquifer, I believe we need to discuss your auction practices. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Westridge County Auction Hall stood as a testament to the changing face of Pinewood Valley. Once a simple community gathering space with wooden benches and practical amenities, it had been renovated 5 years ago with polished marble floors, digital displays, and a sophisticated sound system that contrasted sharply with the surrounding farmland. The transformation of the auction hall mirrored the transformation of the valley itself, as agricultural land increasingly gave way to luxury developments, golf courses, and vacation properties for wealthy out-of-state buyers. Richard Blackwell had been instrumental in this transformation. At 54, the auction director had built Prestige Properties Auction House into the region's premier venue for high-end real estate transactions. His tailored suits, cologne that cost more than most local farmers earned in a week, and his BMW sedan, with personalized plates reading "Sold It," set him apart from the community, where most vehicles were mud-splattered trucks with decades of loyal service. Blackwell specialized in what he called transitional properties, a euphemism locals recognized as farms being sold to developers. Today's auction featured the crown jewel of Pinewood Valley, the historic Oakridge Farm, with its 275 acres of prime land situated against the Blue Pine Mountains. The property had been in the Simmons family for generations, but after Martin Simmons passed away last winter, his children living in distant cities had decided to cash in on the land's development potential rather than continue its agricultural legacy. The auction catalog described it as an unparalleled opportunity for luxury resort development with mountain views and abundant water resources. What the glossy brochure failed to mention was that Oakridge Farm sat atop the North Pine aquifer, a critical water source for 5 downstream communities. The farm's responsible stewardship had helped maintain water quality for decades, a fact well known to locals but conveniently omitted from the property description that emphasized build-ready acreage with minimal environmental restrictions. By 10:30 that morning, the auction hall was filled with an unusual mix of attendees. Representatives from development companies and investment groups occupied the premium seats near the front, their attention focused on tablets displaying property specifications and potential return on investment calculations. Scattered throughout the back rows were local farmers and longtime residents, not there to bid, but to witness the sale of a property that had defined their community's character for generations. At precisely 11, Richard Blackwell strode confidently to the podium, his voice carrying through the state-of-the-art sound system with practiced authority. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our premium properties exclusive auction. Today, we present an extraordinary opportunity, the historic Oakridge Farm, 275 pristine acres with unmatched development potential. We'll begin bidding at $4, $2 million. Nay! As Blackwell launched into his elaborate description of the property's development possibilities, emphasizing its clean title and minimal restrictions, the auction hall's side door opened quietly. Harold Jenkins, 72, entered with the careful movements of a man whose body carried the memory of decades of physical labor. His faded plaid shirt and worn denim overalls contrasted sharply with the business attire around him. But he carried himself with the quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime working the land. Harold found an empty seat in the back row, acknowledging the nods of recognition from other locals with a slight tip of his weather-beaten cap. In his hands, he clutched a leather-bound journal whose pages had yellowed with age, its cover worn. Smooth from years of handling, the Jenkins family had farmed neighboring land for 3 generations before economic pressures forced them to sell 12 years ago. Harold hadn't come to bid. His modest pension couldn't compete with corporate checkbooks, but to ensure that certain facts about Oakridge Farm weren't conveniently overlooked. As the bidding began, representatives from development companies raised the price in $100,000 increments. Blackwell orchestrated the process with theatrical flourish, his enthusiasm growing with each climbing bid. $4, $6 million from Sunbelt Developments. Do I hear 4-7? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this property offers unrestricted building potential in the most desirable location in 3 counties. Harold Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The phrase, unrestricted building potential, didn't align with what he knew about the land. He'd spent 50 years walking those hills, working alongside Martin Simmons to maintain the delicate balance between agriculture and water conservation. His journal contained detailed maps of the underground springs and seasonal water patterns. Knowledge accumulated through generations of observation. During a brief pause between bidding rounds, Harold raised his hand. The movement was tentative, but determined. "Excuse me," he called, his voice carrying a surprising strength that caused Blackwell to glance toward the back of the room, with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes, sir? Are you entering a bid?" Blackwell asked, knowing full well the elderly farmer wasn't a potential buyer. "No, sir," Harold replied, standing slowly, "but there's important information about this property that isn't being disclosed. The north section contains protected wetlands, and there's documented water rights agreements that restrict development on 35 acres above the primary aquifer access points." A murmur ran through the crowd as several corporate representatives exchanged concerned glances. Blackwell's practiced smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, I assure you that our legal team has thoroughly vetted all aspects of this property. The title is clean and all legal disclosures have been properly made," Blackwell responded smoothly. "Now, shall we continue with respect?" Harold interrupted, opening his journal. "I helped draft those water agreements with Martin Simmons back in 1986. They're registered with the county and the state water board. Any buyer should know they can't build on the North Wetlands section without violating state watershed protection statutes." Blackwell's professional demeanor slipped slightly as he stepped away from the podium and approached the elderly farmer. "Mr. Jenkins, Harold Jenkins." "Mr. Jenkins, this is a private business event for qualified buyers. If you're not here to bid, I must ask you to refrain from disrupting the proceedings with..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Do outdated information." Harold stood his ground, his weathered hands steady as he held up his journal. "This isn't outdated information. I served on the County Water Commission for 22 years. The aquifer protection agreements are legally binding and would significantly impact any development plans." Blackwell's voice dropped, though several nearby attendees could still hear him. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand that seeing these old farms change hands must be difficult for certain and traditional elements in the community. But progress and development are inevitable. These properties will be transformed to better serve the evolving economy of our region." "I'm not opposing progress," Harold replied calmly. "I'm simply ensuring that buyers have accurate information about legal restrictions that affect the property's development potential. That's basic disclosure law." Blackwell's patience visibly thinned. "Our disclosures are compliant with all legal requirements. Now, unless you're prepared to place a minimum bid of $2 million, I must ask you to remain silent or leave." Harold persisted, turning slightly to address the potential buyers directly. "The North Pine Aquifer provides water for 5 communities downstream. The protection agreement limits construction within 100 yards of the primary springs. Any buyer should—" "Security," Blackwell called sharply, motioning toward 2 men in dark blazers near the entrance. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's disrupting a legitimate business transaction with unsubstantiated claims." The security personnel approached as whispers rippled through the crowd. Harold's expression reflected not anger, but a profound disappointment. "I'm simply providing factual information about the property," he stated quietly. "Potential buyers deserve to know what they're purchasing." Blackwell's voice took on a dismissive tone intended to be heard by his wealthy clients. "Mr. Jenkins, the auction process requires professional decorum. Your outdated farming practices and empty bank account have no place at a premium property auction. This land, like everything else, belongs to those with the vision and resources to develop it properly." A flash of pain crossed Harold's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully closed his journal and nodded to the security guards. "I'll see myself out, gentlemen. No need for an escort." As he walked toward the exit, Harold paused and turned back to the room. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the suddenly silent auction hall. "The land has a memory longer than any deed or title. The water flows where it will, regardless of who claims to own it on paper." With that cryptic statement, he exited into the bright spring sunshine, leaving an uncomfortable silence that Blackwell quickly filled with forced enthusiasm. "My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Some folks struggle to accept that land use evolves with economic progress. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, we have $4. $6 million from Sunbelt Developments. Do I hear $4? $7 million for this exceptional property." The auction resumed, but several bidders were now engaged in hushed conversations with their colleagues, some tapping urgently on their phones. Blackwell maintained his professional facade, but inwardly he seethed at the disruption. The last thing he needed was questions about environmental restrictions, complicating his perfectly orchestrated sale. Outside in the parking lot, Harold Jenkins sat in his faded blue pickup truck, the once bright paint now dulled by years of sun exposure. He hadn't started the engine yet. Instead, he pulled out his cell phone, not the latest model, but a practical device that served his needs. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed the call button. "Margaret, it's Dad," he said when the call connected. "Sorry to bother you when I know you're busy, but there's a situation with the Oak Ridge Farm auction. They're selling it without disclosing the aquifer protection agreements." He listened for a moment, nodding slightly. No, don't worry about that. They just asked me to leave. Yes, I'm fine. Just concerned about the water rights for the downstream communities." He paused, listening again. "I know you're in meetings all day, but I thought you should be aware. This development could impact the entire watershed you've been working to protect." As Harold ended the call, he didn't notice Richard Blackwell, watching from the auction house window, a satisfied smirk on his face as he saw the old farmer climbing into his truck. In Blackwell's mind, he had eliminated a potential complication to his perfectly orchestrated land sale. He had no idea that his smug certainty was about to be shattered in less than 90 minutes. The auction resumed its steady rhythm after Harold Jenkins's departure. Blackwell had quickly re-established control of the room, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the brief disruption. The corporate representatives continued their bidding war, though a few were now huddled with their legal advisors, quietly reviewing documents on their tablets. "We're now at $2 million for this exceptional property," Blackwell announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who knew he was about to make a substantial commission. "Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this represents not just acreage, but opportunity, the chance to transform agricultural history into the future of luxury recreation." In the parking lot, Harold Jenkins still sat in his truck, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel as he gazed at the rolling hills of Oakridge Farm, visible in the distance. The spring sunshine illuminated the rich tapestry of fields where generations of the Simmons family had worked alongside neighbors like himself to maintain the delicate balance between productivity and stewardship. Harold wasn't fighting against change or progress. He had accepted long ago that farming communities evolve and that economic pressures force difficult choices. What he couldn't accept was the deliberate concealment of crucial information that would affect not just the property itself, but the entire watershed and the communities that depended on it. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Harold glanced in his rearview mirror and was surprised to see a procession of black SUVs turning into the auction house parking lot. The lead vehicle bore the subtle but unmistakable emblem of the State Environmental Protection Agency, followed by two more official vehicles and a county sheriff's cruiser. "Oh, Margaret," Harold murmured, recognizing the government motorcade. "You didn't have to do this." Inside the auction house, Blackwell was in his element, having just secured a $4 million bid from Horizon Resorts. "Excellent. That's $4 million from Horizon. Do I hear five? Five? Remember, this property includes water rights that support immediate development of recreation facilities, including the potential for a championship golf course." A representative from Summit Development raised his paddle. $5 million. "I have $5 million. Do I hear?" Blackwell's patter was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. The auction house's large windows offered a clear view of the parking lot, where attendees could now see the procession of official vehicles coming to a stop. "As I was saying," Blackwell continued, attempting to recapture the room's attention, "we have $5 million. Do I hear five? Six? A bid, but the bidders were distracted now, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched several uniformed officers and professionally dressed officials emerging from the vehicles. When the lead SUV's door opened and a woman in a tailored suit stepped out, several people in the room audibly gasped. "Is that the State Environmental Director?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard throughout the room. Blackwell's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have important business to conduct. I'm sure whatever official matter is taking place outside can proceed without our attention. Now, do I hear $6 million for this premium property?" The auction house doors swung open, and two uniformed environmental compliance officers entered, scanning the room with professional detachment. Behind them came a woman in her early 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical yet elegant style. Her bearing commanded instant respect, and her ID badge identified her as Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, State Environmental Director. Flanking her were the County Commissioner Benjamin Torres and what appeared to be several members of the state's legal team, all carrying folders and digital tablets. Harold Jenkins entered last, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but resolute nonetheless. Richard Blackwell's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally an attempt at professional courtesy. "Director Jenkins-Cooper, this is an unexpected honor. We're in the middle of an auction, but of course you're welcome to observe. Perhaps your team would like to place a bid on behalf of the state parks system. Margaret Jenkins-Cooper ignored Blackwell entirely, instead turning to address the room at large. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings, but an urgent matter of public interest has come to my attention. Her voice carried natural authority, without needing to be raised. I've been informed that this auction may be proceeding without full disclosure of legal encumbrances on the property. Blackwell moved quickly from behind his podium. Director, I assure you that all legal requirements have been meticulously followed. Our title research is impeccable. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwell, the director replied coolly. I've just spoken with the State Water Resources Board. They've confirmed the existence of aquifer protection agreements affecting significant portions of the Oakridge property, specifically the northern 35 acres and the eastern watershed section. County Commissioner Torres stepped forward, opening his folder. We have certified copies of the protection agreements right here, filed in 1986 and amended in 2002. These legal instruments explicitly prohibit certain types of development, including golf courses and impermeable surfaces exceeding 20% of the protected zones. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience, particularly among the corporate bidders who had already committed millions to a property that now appeared to have significant restrictions. These restrictions would impact approximately 40% of the total acreage, Torres continued, and would substantially affect the development potential you've been promoting. Blackwell's confident facade began to crack. Director Jenkins-Cooper, with all due respect, my legal team conducted thorough due diligence. If such agreements exist, they would have been disclosed in our materials. They should have been, Jenkins-Cooper agreed, which raises serious questions about your auction practices. Either your legal team missed critical encumbrances, which constitutes negligence, or these restrictions were deliberately omitted, which would constitute fraud. The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Blackwell and the state officials. I don't appreciate these insinuations, Director, Blackwell said, struggling to maintain his composure. These properties have been properly vetted according to standard industry practices. Industry practices don't supersede state law, Mr. Blackwell, one of the legal team members interjected. And state law requires full disclosure of all encumbrances before sale, particularly those affecting environmental resources as critical as the North Pine aquifer. Director Jenkins-Cooper turned to address the bidders directly. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investments based on incomplete information, I'm exercising my authority to request a temporary halt to these proceedings, pending a full review of the property records. She nodded to the environmental officers who moved to stand on either side of Blackwell's podium. This is not an action I take lightly, but as State Environmental Director, I have a responsibility to ensure that all business conducted in our state adheres to our laws, particularly when it involves resources as vital as our watershed. Blackwell looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but the corporate representatives were already on their phones, clearly consulting with their legal departments. This is unprecedented interference in a private business transaction, he protested. On the contrary, Director Jenkins-Cooper replied calmly, this is the state fulfilling its obligation to protect both consumers and natural resources. My father attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels, and you had him removed. All eyes turned to Harold Jenkins, who stood quietly at the back of the room, still clutching his leather journal. There was a moment of collective realization as the bidders connected the elderly farmer with the state director. Your father, Blackwell stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection himself. Yes, Mr. Blackwell, Harold Jenkins, the farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account you so dismissively ejected, is my father. He served on the County Water Commission for over 2 decades and helped draft the very agreements you failed to disclose. The director's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath her calm exterior. More importantly, he was trying to ensure that all parties to this sale had accurate information, something you actively prevented. Blackwell looked desperately toward his legal counsel, who had sunk low in his chair, already recognizing the severity of the situation. Director Jenkins-Cooper, Blackwell began, attempting to recover. Had I known Mr. Jenkins was your father? Had you known, she interrupted sharply, would you have treated him with the respect every citizen deserves? Or would you have dismissed his concerns because of his clothes or his age or his empty bank account? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me? Blackwell had no answer. Your auction is suspended pending review, the director continued. The Attorney General's office will be examining all sales conducted by Prestige Properties over the past 5 years to ensure proper disclosure practices were followed. She turned to the assembled bidders. I apologize for any inconvenience this causes to those of you who traveled here in good faith. The state will ensure that when this property is eventually sold, all legal encumbrances will be clearly documented. As the corporate representatives began gathering their materials and filing out, many casting accusatory glances at Blackwell, the auctioneer made one last desperate attempt. Director, surely we can resolve this without such drastic measures? Perhaps a brief recess to review the documentation your father has provided? Mr. Blackwell, Director Jenkins-Cooper said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her office. This isn't merely about documentation. It's about the systematic dismissal of local knowledge and the disregard for water stewardship that has characterized too many transactions in this county. She gestured to the environmental officers. These officers will secure the auction records while our team conducts their initial review. You're welcome to contact your attorney, but I suggest you cooperate fully. As the room quickly emptied, Harold Jenkins approached his daughter. Margaret, I didn't call you to shut down the auction. I just wanted someone to verify the agreement's existence. The director smiled at her father, briefly dropping her official demeanor. I've been thinking about what happened at the auction. You're not the first to dismiss the concerns of an old farmer, and you won't be the last. But there's an opportunity here that might benefit us both. Blackwell raised an eyebrow skeptically. I'm listening. Oak Ridge Farm is still going to be sold, Harold explained, opening his notebook. But whoever buys it needs to understand its complexities, not just the legal restrictions, but the practical knowledge of how the water flows, which fields drain first after heavy rains, where the natural springs lie. Information that doesn't appear in official records. Knowledge that could be valuable to developers, Blackwell acknowledged. Exactly. I've spent my life observing that land. So have other farmers in this valley. We carry knowledge that no satellite mapping or soil sample can provide. Harold tapped his notebook. I've documented seasonal changes, water patterns, and soil conditions across 5 decades. This knowledge has value, not to stop development, but to ensure it proceeds intelligently. Blackwell studied the older man, beginning to understand. You're suggesting a partnership of some kind. A collaboration, Harold corrected. Your company provides the market expertise and connections to investors. But moving forward, you incorporate local knowledge and environmental stewardship into your sales approach, not as restrictions, but as value-added insights. The idea was so different from Blackwell's usual business model that his initial instinct was to dismiss it. But recent events had made it abundantly clear that his traditional approach was no longer viable in the changing regulatory environment. Your daughter mentioned something similar, Blackwell admitted. She suggested my expertise could contribute to responsible rural development. Harold nodded. Margaret sees the bigger picture. This isn't about punishing you or stopping progress. It's about ensuring that progress respects the land's natural systems. Blackwell found himself considering the proposal seriously. His business was at a crossroads. Continue fighting against the tide of environmental regulations and transparency requirements, or adapt and possibly discover new opportunities. I'd need to completely restructure my approach, he said, thinking aloud. My clients expect clean, unrestricted properties they can develop however they choose. And how's that working out for them? Harold asked mildly. The lakeside resort that Meridian Group built 4 years ago has struggled with water quality issues because they built too close to the watershed. The Hillcrest development abandoned their golf course plans midway because they couldn't manage the drainage problems. Blackwell was surprised by the old farmer's detailed knowledge of recent developments. You've been paying attention. These are my neighbors, Mr. Blackwell. I may have lost my own farm, but I still care about this valley. Harold leaned forward. What if your auctions included comprehensive land management plans alongside property deeds? What if buyers received not just legal titles, but ecological understanding? The conversation continued for over 2 hours, evolving from tentative idea to concrete proposal. By the time Harold Jenkins left Blackwell's office, something fundamental had shifted in the auctioneer's perspective. The land was no longer just a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, but a complex living system with needs and patterns that any responsible owner should understand. The transformation of prestige properties began gradually over the following months. Blackwell hired Harold Jenkins as a consultant, along with 2 other retired farmers with extensive knowledge of local land conditions. Property listings now included detailed environmental assessments and sustainable development recommendations. Most significantly, Blackwell implemented a new policy of complete transparency regarding all legal encumbrances and ecological considerations. Initially, some corporate clients balked at the new approach, preferring the old system that emphasized development potential while minimizing restrictions. But a surprising number of investors, particularly younger, more environmentally conscious firms, were attracted to the comprehensive information now provided with each property. 6 months after the confrontation at the auction house, Blackwell found himself standing in Oakridge Farm's North Field with a potential buyer. Not a corporate developer, but the representative of a sustainable agritourism investment group. The water protection agreements actually make this property more attractive for our purposes, the investor explained as they surveyed the land. We're looking to establish a demonstration site for integrated farming and recreation that maintains the watershed integrity, and these protections align perfectly with our mission. Blackwell nodded, finding himself genuinely interested in the group's vision rather than simply focused on closing the sale. Mr. Jenkins mentioned this section has particularly rich soil composition due to the seasonal moisture patterns. His notes suggest it would be ideal for certain heritage crop varieties that could become part of your visitor experience. The investor looked surprised but pleased. That's exactly what our agronomist recommended. How did you know? Let's just say I've been getting an education in actual farming, not just farm sales, Blackwell replied, thinking of the hours he'd spent with Harold walking these fields and listening to decades of accumulated wisdom. The most profound evidence of Blackwell's transformation came during the rescheduled auction of Oakridge Farm. The event bore little resemblance to the exclusive gathering he had originally planned. Local farmers sat alongside corporate representatives. The county soil and water conservation district had a booth providing information on sustainable land management. Most noticeably, Harold Jenkins and 2 other senior farmers sat near the podium as official consultants, their expertise acknowledged as valuable to the proceedings. Before beginning the bidding, Blackwell addressed the gathered crowd. Welcome to the Oak Ridge Farm auction. Before we start, I want to acknowledge some significant changes in how we conduct these sales. Every property offered today comes with a complete environmental assessment, historical land use documentation, and clear disclosure of all legal encumbrances. He gestured toward Harold and the other farmers. We're fortunate to have local experts who have generously shared their knowledge of these lands, insights that go far beyond what any title search or soil test could reveal. I encourage all potential bidders to consult with them before bidding. The auction proceeded with a different energy than Blackwell's previous events. Bidders asked thoughtful questions about sustainable land management. Corporate representatives consulted with the farmer experts about watershed dynamics. When the final gavel fell, Oak Ridge Farm sold for a sum that exceeded even Blackwell's original projections, not despite the environmental covenants, but partly because of the ecological integrity they protected. After the auction, Director Jenkins-Cooper made an unannounced appearance. She surveyed the transformed proceedings with approval before approaching Blackwell. "Quite a different atmosphere from our last encounter, Mr. Blackwell," she observed. Blackwell straightened his shoulders. "We've made some adjustments to our approach, Director." "So I see." She glanced toward her father, who was deep in conversation with the property's new owners, sketching something in his ever-present notebook. "My father tells me you've been surprisingly receptive to his suggestions. Your father has forgotten more about this land than most of us will ever know," Blackwell admitted. "I was foolish to dismiss that knowledge." Director Jenkins-Cooper studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when I arrived at that auction 3 months ago, I expected to shut down a business that was harming our rural communities. Instead, it appears you've created a model that might help preserve them." Coming from the director, the observation felt like significant validation. "The credit belongs to your father. He saw potential where I initially saw only obstacles." As the director moved away to join her father, Blackwell found himself approached by a young farmer he recognized from community meetings, the owner of one of the small operations downstream from Oak Ridge Farm. "Mr. Blackwell," the young man said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about selling a portion of my property to fund irrigation improvements on the remaining acres. Would your new approach work for a smaller parcel like mine?" 6 months earlier, Blackwell would have dismissed the query as too small to be worth his time. Now he recognized something more important than the commission potential, the opportunity to facilitate a transaction that respected both the land's needs and the community's future. "I believe it would," he replied thoughtfully. "Why don't we walk your property next week? Bring your historical records, and perhaps Mr. Jenkins might join us for his perspective." As the gathering dispersed, Blackwell watched Harold Jenkins showing the new owners of Oak Ridge Farm a particular feature of the landscape, pointing to the way water flowed across the contours of the land, knowledge accumulated through generations of observation. Blackwell realized something fundamental had shifted within him. The validation he had once desperately sought through exclusive deals and wealthy clients now seemed hollow, compared to the genuine satisfaction of facilitating transitions that honored the land and its history. Harold caught his eye across the room and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, a simple gesture that somehow meant more than all the prestigious connections and luxury trappings that had previously defined Blackwell's success. The auctioneer, who had once dismissed a farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account, now recognized that true wealth came in forms that couldn't be measured in bank accounts or property deeds, a lesson that had transformed not just his business practices but his understanding of value itself. 5 years later, the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Heritage Center opened its doors on a perfect spring morning, the kind that farmers throughout the region recognized as ideal planting weather. The renovated barn that once stood at the heart of Oakridge Farm now served as the centerpiece of a community institution dedicated to sustainable land management and the preservation of rural knowledge. Outside, a diverse crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, local farmers in work clothes, corporate representatives in business attire, government officials, and families from throughout the county. They stood together on land that had nearly become another anonymous development, but instead had transformed into something unique: a working demonstration farm, educational center, and community gathering place. Director Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, now in her second term and with a growing national reputation for innovative rural policy, approached the podium set up on the barn's wide porch. At 57, she carried the same commanding presence that had stopped an auction in its tracks 5 years earlier, though her silver-streaked hair now had more silver than dark. "Welcome, everyone, to what I believe represents the future of rural America," she began, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, this property stood at the center of a controversy about how we value land and whose knowledge counts when making decisions about its use. In the front row, 77-year-old Harold Jenkins sat with quiet dignity, his weathered hands resting on a familiar leather notebook. Beside him, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the place of honor but present nonetheless, sat Richard Blackwell, whose transformation had become almost as legendary as the confrontation that sparked it. "Today," the director continued, "Oakridge Farm stands as a testament to what happens when we combine traditional knowledge with modern innovation, when we recognize that the highest value of land isn't always reflected in its sale price." The director gestured toward her father and Blackwell. "I want to acknowledge two men whose unlikely partnership made today possible. My father, Harold Jenkins, who stood up for the land when it needed a voice, and Richard Blackwell, who demonstrated that true leadership often means having the courage to change course when presented with new understanding." The crowd applauded as both men nodded in acknowledgement, their former antagonism long since transformed into a productive working relationship that had reshaped land transactions throughout the state. After Blackwell's pioneering changes to his auction practices, other auctioneers and real estate firms had initially mocked his unnecessary complications. But when buyers began specifically seeking out prestige properties for their comprehensive approach to land sales, competitors had quickly followed suit. What began as one man's reluctant adaptation had evolved into a new standard for agricultural property transfers. The Pinewood Valley Agricultural Heritage Center represents more than just the preservation of this historic property. Director Jenkins-Cooper continued. It embodies a new approach to land stewardship that recognizes the value of generational knowledge and the importance of maintaining ecological integrity alongside economic development. The center had become a hub for the community in ways no one had initially imagined. Local schools brought students for hands-on agricultural education. Farmers from across the state came to learn about sustainable practices. Researchers used the demonstration fields to test climate-adaptive crop varieties. Even the corporate, agricultural firms that had once viewed environmental considerations as mere obstacles now sent representatives to learn techniques that could reduce costs while improving land quality. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as attendees explored the newly opened center, Harold Jenkins found a quiet moment with his daughter near the small pond that had once been threatened by development plans. "Your mother would have loved this," he said softly, gazing across the carefully maintained wetlands that now served as both wildlife habitat and natural water filtration for the surrounding farms. Director Jenkins-Cooper smiled, linking her arm through her father's. "She always said you were stubborn enough for both of you. Turns out she was right." "Wasn't stubbornness," Harold corrected gently. "Just knew the land deserved better than to be carved up without consideration for how it all works together." Well, that stubbornness has changed how we approach rural development across the state, his daughter replied. The Jenkins-Blackwell Protocol is being adopted in 4 neighboring states. The Jenkins-Blackwell Protocol, as it had come to be, known in policy circles, established standards for agricultural land sales that included comprehensive environmental assessment, documentation of traditional knowledge, and transparent disclosure of all ecological implications. What had begun as a confrontation in an auction house had evolved into a framework for balancing development with preservation. Across the gathering, Richard Blackwell was engaged in conversation with several young farmers, eager to discuss the upcoming sale of adjoining properties. At 59, Blackwell had transformed not just his business practices, but his entire approach to his role in the community. Where once he had viewed local farmers as obstacles to profitable transactions, he now saw them as essential partners in sustainable land management. The key, he was explaining to the group, is understanding that the value of agricultural land isn't just in its development potential. It's in the accumulated knowledge of how that specific piece of earth functions within the larger ecosystem. One of the young farmers gestured toward Harold Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins has been helping us map the seasonal water patterns on our family's property. Some of those observations go back to my grandfather's time. Blackwell nodded appreciatively. That kind of generational knowledge is invaluable. When we include it in property listings, buyers recognize they're getting more than just acres. They're getting wisdom that can prevent costly mistakes. This approach had not just reformed land sales, it had begun healing the deep divisions between longtime agricultural families and more recent investors by creating a framework that valued local knowledge and environmental stewardship. The Jenkins-Blackwell Protocol had established common ground between groups that had once viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued, Blackwell found himself approached by a corporate representative he recognized from the original Oakridge auction. One of the bidders who had been prepared to develop the property without regard for the watershed agreements. Quite a change from 5 years ago, the man observed, gesturing toward the thriving demonstration farm that now occupied the land he had once hoped to purchase. Blackwell nodded. I'd say for the better, wouldn't you? Surprisingly, yes. The representative looked thoughtful. My firm was initially frustrated when the original auction was halted, but watching how this property has been managed since then has actually influenced our approach to other agricultural investments. Turns out, respecting the land's natural systems is good business. Something Mr. Jenkins tried to tell us that day, Blackwell acknowledged. We just weren't ready to listen. As the day drew to a close, Director Jenkins-Cooper gathered the key stakeholders for a photograph in front of the renovated barn. Harold Jenkins and other local farmers, Richard Blackwell, and representatives from his reformed auction house, the sustainable investment group that had purchased the property, and researchers from the Agricultural Extension Service. They stood together, this unlikely alliance that had transformed not just a single property, but an entire approach to rural land management. Harold Jenkins stood at the center of the group, his presence a living connection to the agricultural traditions they were working to preserve. Beside him, Richard Blackwell represented how confrontation could lead to transformation rather than merely creating winners and losers. 5 years ago, we stood as adversaries in an auction house, Harold remarked quietly to Blackwell as they posed for the photograph. Now look at us. Blackwell smiled, acknowledging the profound journey they had taken together. Best mistake I ever made, throwing you out of that auction. The photograph captured a moment of genuine collaboration among groups that had once been at odds, a visual representation of what was possible when financial interests and environmental stewardship were seen as complementary rather than competing values. As the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set over Pinewood Valley, Harold Jenkins walked slowly through fields he had known since childhood. Though he no longer owned this land, his connection to it ran deeper than any property deed could reflect. His knowledge, once dismissed as irrelevant by those who saw only development potential, now informed every aspect of how the property was managed. Director Jenkins-Cooper found her father standing near the old oak tree that had been a landmark for generations of farmers. "Ready to head home, Dad? It's been a long day." Harold nodded, but his gaze remained on the gently rolling fields, now illuminated by the golden light of sunset. "You know, when Blackwell had me escorted out of that auction, I never imagined it would lead to all this. I just wanted them to know about the watershed agreements. Sometimes the smallest actions have the largest consequences," his daughter observed. "Your stand that day changed how we think about land in this state." As they walked toward the parking area, they passed Richard Blackwell, who was preparing to leave as well. The two men, once adversaries, now unlikely allies, exchanged a look of mutual respect that needed no words to convey its meaning. "Mr. Jenkins," Blackwell said, extending his hand, "another successful day for Pinewood Valley." Harold shook the offered hand firmly. "Indeed, though I think we're just getting started." The simple exchange represented something profound, not just a personal reconciliation, but a template for how rural communities might navigate the complex challenges of preserving agricultural heritage while embracing necessary change. As Harold and Director Jenkins-Cooper drove away from the Heritage Center, they passed the spot where the state environmental agency vehicles had come to a stop. 5 years earlier, the moment when a director's authority had intervened to protect a farmer's knowledge. That dramatic confrontation had yielded not to continued conflict, but to collaboration and innovation that benefited the entire community. "The land has a memory," Harold murmured, echoing words he had spoken during that fateful auction. His daughter smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his simple phrase. "And thanks to you, so will future generations." Behind them, the Agricultural Heritage Center stood as a monument not to any individual but to the principle that had guided Harold Jenkins throughout his life. The understanding that land was not merely a commodity to be bought and sold, but a living system that required respect and stewardship. The center's mission statement, displayed prominently at its entrance, expressed this philosophy in words drawn directly from Harold's weathered notebook. "The land remembers how it has been treated. Our task is to ensure those memories are of nurturing rather than exploitation, of wisdom rather than expedience, of stewardship that spans generations rather than profit measured in quarters." These words, once dismissed as the sentimental musings of a farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account, now guided land management decisions throughout the region, a testament to how quickly transformation could occur when confrontation led to understanding rather than merely establishing winners and losers. And it had all begun with a moment of humiliation in an auction house, a state director's intervention, and the courage of people on both sides to grow beyond their initial positions towards something wiser and more enduring than either could have created alone. 15 years later, the National Rural Heritage Conference held in Washington, D.C., buzzed with energy as representatives from agricultural communities across the country gathered to exchange ideas about sustainable land management and preservation of farming traditions. The grand ballroom of the conference center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, a presentation on the transformative impact of what was now widely known as the Jenkins-Blackwell model. At the podium stood Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of the Rural Sustainability Institute and one of the country's leading experts on agricultural policy. Behind her, a large screen displayed the now iconic photograph taken 10 years earlier at the opening of the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Heritage Center. Harold Jenkins and Richard Blackwell standing side by side, their unlikely alliance having sparked a movement that had spread far beyond their small community. 15 years ago, Dr. Vasquez began. An elderly farmer was escorted out of an auction house for attempting to share information about watershed protection agreements on land being sold for development. That seemingly small moment of conflict has resulted in what many now recognize as the most significant reform in agricultural land management policy of the past half-century. In the front row sat Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, now 67, and recently retired after serving 2 terms as State Environmental Director and later as the Federal Secretary of Environmental Protection. Beside her sat Richard Blackwell, now in his mid-70s, but still actively involved in the rural land stewardship programs he had helped establish. Harold Jenkins was no longer with them, having passed away peacefully 4 years earlier at the age of 88. But his presence was felt throughout the conference that had dedicated its proceedings to his memory. The Jenkins-Blackwell model began as a local response to a specific conflict, Dr. Vasquez continued, but its principles have proven remarkably adaptable across diverse agricultural contexts. Today, 32 states have adopted some version of the integrated assessment protocols that began in Pinewood Valley, and federal agencies now incorporate traditional knowledge documentation in all agricultural land transactions involving government funding. The transformation that had begun with one confrontation at a rural auction house had gradually expanded into a comprehensive approach to land management that bridged divides between environmental concerns, economic interests, and cultural preservation. What Richard Blackwell had initially viewed as an unwelcome complication to his business model had evolved into a framework that created value for all stakeholders in the agricultural ecosystem. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Vasquez noted, we've seen a 48% reduction in water rights litigation in regions that have fully implemented the model, along with measurable improvements in soil health and watershed integrity. When we honor the knowledge of those who have worked the land for generations, we make better decisions about its future. After the keynote address, the conference broke into specialized sessions, with Richard Blackwell leading a workshop on reforming auction and real estate practices to better serve both sellers and the land itself. The man who had once mockingly dismissed a farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account now championed the integration of ecological understanding into every aspect of property transactions. The key insight, Blackwell explained, to his packed session is recognizing that land carries multiple forms of value: economic, ecological, cultural, and historical. When we acknowledge all these dimensions in our transactions, we create outcomes that benefit both buyers and the broader community. His approach had not just reformed his own business, but had spawned an entirely new professional certification: land stewardship advisors, specialists who bridged the gap between traditional real estate services and environmental consulting. Young professionals from both rural and urban backgrounds were now pursuing careers that combined financial expertise with ecological understanding, many of them inspired by the story of how Blackwell's confrontation with Harold Jenkins had led to his own profound transformation. In another conference room, Margaret Jenkins-Cooper participated in a panel discussion on integrating agricultural heritage into economic development strategies. Though no longer in public office, her influence on rural policy remained substantial through her foundation work and advisory roles. The real lesson from Pinewood Valley, she told the audience, wasn't just about protecting one piece of land or one water agreement, It was about recognizing that the knowledge held by long-term stewards of the land represents intellectual capital that deserves both respect and compensation. This principle had manifested in the creation of a radical new approach to property valuation, one that factored in knowledge equity alongside traditional measures of land value. Farmers who had documented generations of observations about their land could now monetize this intellectual property when transitioning their operations, creating financial recognition for wisdom that had previously been dismissed as merely anecdotal. During the conference luncheon, Jenkins-Cooper found herself seated with a group of young farmers from diverse backgrounds, all participants in the Harold Jenkins Fellowship Program that provided training in both traditional agricultural knowledge and modern sustainable techniques. My grandmother's farm was being sold for development when she heard about the Jenkins-Blackwell approach, explained one young woman from Wisconsin. The comprehensive assessment revealed unique soil characteristics that made the property far more valuable for specialized crop production than for housing. Now I'm operating a successful organic farm on land that almost became another subdivision. Similar stories echoed around the table, tales of farms saved, watersheds protected, and rural heritage preserved through the application of principles that had emerged from that fateful confrontation 15 years earlier. As the conference continued into its second day, attendees toured the newly established National Agricultural Knowledge Repository, a digital and physical archive that documented traditional farming practices, ecosystem observations, and land management techniques from rural communities across America. The repository's central hall featured a life-sized bronze statue of Harold Jenkins, depicted sitting on a fence with his notebook open, eternally recording his observations of the land he loved. Richard Blackwell paused before the statue, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man he had once dismissed as irrelevant had left a legacy that would influence agricultural practices for generations to come. He would have been embarrassed by all this attention, Jenkins-Cooper commented, joining Blackwell beside her father's likeness. Blackwell nodded in agreement. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted the land to be respected. And now it is, Jenkins-Cooper replied, in ways none of us could have imagined that day at the auction house. They stood in companionable silence, these once adversaries whose conflict had yielded not to bitterness but to a productive partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others across rural America. Later that evening, at the conference's formal dinner, Richard Blackwell received the inaugural Harold Jenkins Stewardship Award for his role in developing and promoting sustainable land transaction practices. As he accepted the honor, he reflected on the irony of receiving an award named for a man he had once had removed from his auction. Harold Jenkins taught me the most valuable lesson of my career, Blackwell told the assembled guests. He showed me that the true value of land cannot be measured solely in dollars per acre. Its worth lies in the complex web of relationships, ecological, cultural, and economic, that sustain both the land itself and the communities that depend upon it. He held up the award, a small bronze replica of Harold's weathered notebook. I accept this honor with humility, knowing that my greatest contribution was simply having the wisdom to listen when a farmer tried to teach an auctioneer about what really matters. The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for Blackwell's remarks, but recognition of the broader principle they embodied. That transformation often begins with conflict, but can lead to collaboration when people remain open to growth and learning. After the ceremony, Margaret Jenkins-Cooper invited Blackwell to join her on the conference center's terrace, which offered a sweeping view of the capital city. As they looked out over the illuminated monuments, she handed him a small package, wrapped in simple brown paper. I found this while going through Dad's things, she explained. I think he would have wanted you to have it. Blackwell carefully unwrapped the package to reveal Harold Jenkins' leather notebook, the same one he had clutched during that confrontation 15 years earlier. The pages were filled with meticulous observations about the land, weather patterns, and wildlife, alongside philosophical reflections about stewardship and responsibility. "I can't accept this," Blackwell said, deeply moved by the gesture. "This belongs in the repository with his other papers." Jenkins-Cooper shook her head. "The repository has his other notebooks, but this one, the one he had with him that day, I think he would want it to remind you of how far you've both come." Blackwell carefully opened the worn cover, noticing for the first time an inscription on the inside page. A quote Harold had written decades earlier. "The measure of our lives is not what we accumulate, but what we preserve for those who follow." "He was writing a book, you know," Jenkins-Cooper said quietly, "in those last few years. He finished it just before he passed. It's being published next month. The Land Remembers, a Farmer's Philosophy of Stewardship." "I'll be first in line to buy it," Blackwell replied, still carefully holding the notebook that represented both his greatest professional misstep and the beginning of his most meaningful work. As they returned to the conference, they passed an exhibit showcasing the impact of the Jenkins-Blackwell model across diverse agricultural communities. Photographs of restored watersheds, thriving family farms, and collaborative land management. Projects that bridge traditional divides between environmental and economic interests. One display particularly caught their attention: a map showing the spread of the model from Pinewood Valley outward, like ripples expanding across a pond. What had begun as a local conflict had eventually influenced land management practices in communities across the country and was now being adapted for international applications. "Did you ever imagine it would go this far?" Jenkins-Cooper asked, studying the map. Blackwell shook his head. "I was just trying to save my business after your convoy upended my auction. But somewhere along the way, I discovered there was more satisfaction in doing things right than in doing them profitably." Though it turns out, Jenkins-Cooper observed, that doing things right eventually became profitable too. It was true. Blackwell's reformed auction house had not just survived the transition, but had thrived, becoming the industry leader in sustainable land transactions. His willingness to integrate ecological understanding and traditional knowledge into property sales had positioned his firm at the forefront of a significant shift in how agricultural land was valued and transferred. The conference concluded the following day with the ceremonial planting of heritage apple trees on the grounds of the Department of Agriculture. Saplings propagated from stock grown at the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Heritage Center, which had become a national model for integrated farming and education facilities. As participants gathered for the planting, Dr. Vasquez invited Margaret Jenkins-Cooper to share a few closing thoughts. 15 years ago, Jenkins-Cooper began, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd, my father stood in an auction house, trying to protect agreements that preserved a watershed. He wasn't fighting for his own land that had been sold years before. He was standing up for principles that transcended property ownership. She gestured toward the young trees waiting to be planted. These saplings carry genetic material that my father preserved on our family farm decades ago, varieties that might otherwise have been lost. Like the principles he defended, they represent a living connection between past and future, a reminder that our role is not to consume resources, but to steward them for generations yet to come. As she spoke, Richard Blackwell found himself thinking about how completely his understanding of value had transformed since that confrontation. The man who had once measured success in commission percentages and sale prices now found deeper satisfaction in transactions that honored both the land itself and the knowledge of those who tended it. When the ceremonial planting was complete, the conference participants gathered for a final photograph. Representatives from farming communities across the nation stood together beneath a banner that read, "The Land Remembers, honoring the Jenkins-Blackwell legacy." The phrase had become shorthand for an approach that valued agricultural heritage not as nostalgia, but as vital knowledge essential for sustainable future development. And it had all begun with an elderly farmer being escorted from an auction, House and Estate Director's intervention arriving just in time to transform humiliation into opportunity. As Blackwell prepared to return to Pinewood Valley the next morning, he took one last look at Harold Jenkins's notebook, running his fingers over the worn leather cover that had witnessed so much. Inside were not just observations about soil and water, but a philosophy that had changed countless lives, including his own. "The land has a memory," Blackwell murmured, echoing Harold's words from that first confrontation. "And thanks to you, Harold, so do we." The notebook would occupy a place of honor in Blackwell's office, a daily reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with moments of conflict, and that wisdom sometimes comes from those we are initially most inclined to dismiss. The farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account had indeed been worn out after decades of working the land, but his spirit and wisdom remained vibrant, continuing to influence how Americans thought about their relationship to the earth long after that dramatic day when a state environmental director had shut down an auction and started a movement. 25 years later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across Pinewood Valley as people gathered for the dedication ceremony at the newly completed Harold Jenkins Memorial Park. What had once been the most contentious parcel of Oakridge Farm, the northern section with its critical aquifer access, was now a protected nature preserve surrounded by thriving sustainable farms. The land that had sparked a confrontation in an auction house 25 years earlier had become a living monument to transformed values and perspectives. Among the honored guests seated on the simple wooden platform was Richard Blackwell, now in his early 80s. Though age had bent his once imposing frame and whitened what remained of his hair, his eyes remained sharp and observant. Beside him sat Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, now in her 70s, her environmental directorship and cabinet service years behind her, but her influence on rural policy still evident in the programs being celebrated today. As the crowd settled, Emily Jenkins, Harold's granddaughter and the current state agricultural commissioner, approached the podium. At 45, she carried echoes of her grandfather in her thoughtful demeanor and deep connection to the land. 25 years ago, on this very ground, she began, two men stood as adversaries in a conflict that could have ended with bitterness and division. Instead, through wisdom and willingness to grow, they transformed that conflict into collaboration. That has reshaped how we value and steward agricultural land across this nation. The gathered crowd included farmers and corporate executives, environmental advocates and development specialists, groups that had once seemed irreconcilably opposed, but now routinely worked together under the frameworks established through what had come to be known as the Jenkins-Blackwell Accords. "My grandfather was not a wealthy man when Richard Blackwell had him escorted from that auction," Emily continued. "He had already lost his own farm to economic hardship, but he understood something that transcended property ownership, that the land itself carries wisdom that deserves to be heard and respected." In the front row, Jason Blackwell, Richard's grandson and now CEO of Blackwell Sustainable Land Services, nodded in agreement. The company that had once specialized in selling farms to the highest bidder, regardless of intended use, now led the nation in facilitating land transfers that balanced economic value with environmental stewardship and community needs. What began that day wasn't just about a water agreement or a single auction, Emily explained. It was about a fundamental reconsideration of what gives land value. Not just its development potential or per-acre price, but its ecological function, its cultural heritage, and its role in sustaining communities across generations. Behind the speaker's platform stood the centerpiece of the Memorial Park, a life-sized bronze sculpture depicting Harold Jenkins and Richard Blackwell seated on opposite ends of a fence, leaning toward each other in conversation. Their initial confrontation had evolved into years of collaboration that neither could have imagined on that fateful day at the auction house. When it came time for Richard Blackwell to speak, he was helped to the podium by his grandson. The man who had once dismissed Harold Jenkins as a farmer with outdated practices and an empty bank account now stood before the community as one of the most powerful advocates for the agricultural wisdom that farmers like Jenkins had cultivated across generations. "I've lived a long life," Blackwell began, his voice softer than in his auctioneer days, but still carrying natural authority. "But I count the years following that confrontation with Harold Jenkins as my most meaningful. He taught me, initially against my will, that the value of land cannot be reduced to its sale price, that its worth lies in relationships and functions that no deed or title can fully capture." Blackwell looked out over the watershed that Harold had fought to protect, now a thriving ecosystem that sustained both wildlife and the agricultural community surrounding it. "I began that day thinking only of commissions and sale prices. Harold helped me see that true value lies in stewardship, in understanding that we hold land in trust for future generations." As Blackwell returned to his seat, Margaret Jenkins-Cooper approached the podium. Though she now walked with a cane, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her intervention 25 years earlier. "When I arrived at that auction with my team," she recalled, "I was simply trying to protect a watershed agreement and prevent my father from being dismissed. I had no idea we were starting a movement that would eventually transform rural land policy across this country." She gestured toward the rolling hills of Pinewood Valley, where the Jenkins-Blackwell principles had been implemented most comprehensively. "What you see around you isn't just preserved land. It's land that continues to produce economically, ecologically, and culturally. We didn't choose between development and preservation. We found a third path that honors both progress and stewardship." The ceremony continued with the unveiling of a simple stone marker bearing words from Harold Jenkins's book, The Land Remembers, which had become a foundational text in agricultural education. "The land holds memory longer than any human institution. It responds not to our words or intentions, but to how we treat it. In this response lies our greatest lesson, that stewardship brings abundance, while exploitation ultimately yields scarcity." After the formal proceedings, the gathering transitioned to a community celebration held in the renovated barn of the original Oakridge homestead. Tables laden with food produced by local farms stretched through the historic structure, tangible evidence of the agricultural vitality that had flourished under the Jenkins-Blackwell approach. Richard Blackwell found himself seated at a table with several young farmers from the area, including a woman whose family had nearly lost their property during the wave of corporate acquisitions that had preceded the Jenkins-Blackwell reforms. "My parents were 2 months from foreclosure when the new valuation principles were implemented," she explained. "Suddenly, the generational knowledge they held about our land was recognized as an asset. The water protection agreements they had, maintained for decades, actually increased our property's value instead of being seen as restrictions." Blackwell nodded, understanding deeply how completely the paradigm had shifted since his days of marketing unrestricted land as the most valuable commodity. Harold Jenkins saw this possibility long before the rest of us, he acknowledged. He understood that protections for natural systems actually create value rather than diminishing it. Across the room, Margaret Jenkins-Cooper engaged with international delegates who had come to study the Jenkins-Blackwell model. The principles are adaptable to diverse agricultural contexts, she explained, whether in America's Midwest or smallholder farms across the global South. The integration of traditional knowledge with scientific understanding creates more resilient agricultural systems. What had begun as a local conflict over a specific property had evolved into a framework being implemented in rural communities worldwide, an approach that recognized the complementary relationship between economic viability and environmental stewardship, rather than positioning them as competitors. As the celebration continued into the evening, Richard Blackwell stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The autumn air carried the scent of recently harvested fields and the distant sound of a stream running through the protected watershed, the very water system Harold Jenkins had fought to defend. Margaret Jenkins-Cooper joined him on the porch, settling into a rocking chair beside his wheelchair. For a moment, these once adversaries sat in companionable silence, their shared journey having transformed initial conflict into deep mutual respect. "I keep thinking about that day," Blackwell said finally, "how differently it all might have gone." "If I hadn't arrived with my team," Jenkins-Cooper suggested. "Or if I hadn't had your father thrown out of my auction," Blackwell acknowledged, with a chuckle. "One of my better mistakes, though it certainly didn't feel that way at the time." "The best lessons rarely do," Jenkins-Cooper replied. "Dad used to say that growth usually feels uncomfortable while you're experiencing it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emily Jenkins and Jason Blackwell, representing the next generation of the unlikely alliance that had begun in confrontation 25 years earlier. "The international delegation is impressed," Emily reported. "They're particularly interested in how the Jenkins-Blackwell frameworks have been formalized into policy while remaining flexible enough to adapt to local conditions." That was the key insight, Richard reflected. Understanding that principles matter more than rigid regulations, that stewardship looks different in different landscapes, but always requires honoring the land's natural systems. Jason nodded. "Grandfather, they're requesting copies of your original implementation journals, the documentation of how you and Harold Jenkins developed the first practical applications of these principles." "Those belong in the Jenkins-Blackwell Institute archives," Blackwell replied, "along with Harold's notebooks. Together, they tell the complete story, not just of conflict and resolution, but of how adversaries can become allies when they recognize shared values beneath surface disagreements." As night fell over Pinewood Valley, the Memorial Park's subtle lighting illuminated the bronze figures of Harold Jenkins and Richard Blackwell, their enduring conversation captured in metal that would outlast all those gathered to celebrate their legacy. The sculpture represented not just two individuals, but the principle they had come to embody, that wisdom emerges when different forms of knowledge are brought into respectful dialogue. The ceremony's final event took place at dusk, when the community gathered at the observation point overlooking the watershed that had been at the center of the original dispute. Solar-powered lanterns were distributed to everyone present, creating a constellation of lights that stretched across the hillside in the gathering darkness. Emily Jenkins addressed the assembled community one last time. "My grandfather often said that the land has a memory of how we treat it. Tonight, we acknowledge that we too must remember the wisdom of those who came before us, the lessons learned through conflict and collaboration, and our responsibility to those who will come after." At her signal, everyone raised their lanterns simultaneously, creating a moving tapestry of light across the landscape. A visual representation of the interconnected community that had emerged from principles established 25 years earlier. Richard Blackwell, watching from his place of honor, felt the weight of the journey he had traveled since that day when he had dismissed an elderly farmer for disrupting his auction. What had begun as the most humiliating professional moment of his career had transformed into its most meaningful chapter, a testament to the possibility that conflict, when approached with openness to growth, could yield wisdom that neither side could have developed alone. Harold would have loved this, Margaret Jenkins-Cooper said softly, standing beside Blackwell as they watched the lanterns move through the darkness. Not the recognition, but seeing the land protected and the community thriving. He saw it. Already, Blackwell replied. That day in the auction house, when the rest of us saw only dollar signs, he saw the living systems beneath our feet. He was just waiting for the rest of us to notice. As the celebration drew to a close and people began to depart, Richard Blackwell remained for a final moment, looking out over the valley that had become both battlefield and healing ground in his long journey from auctioneer to steward. The land that he had once valued only for its sale potential now represented something far more meaningful, a legacy of transformed understanding that would continue long after he was gone. The elderly auctioneer, who had once had Harold Jenkins, escorted from his auction for disrupting business, now carried forward the very principles that Farmer had defended. Their initial antagonism had yielded not to continued conflict, but to collaborative wisdom that neither could have developed alone, a powerful testament to the possibility that even the most difficult confrontations could become catalysts for growth rather than causes for division. And it had all begun with a moment in an auction house, an elderly farmer standing up for principles that transcended property rights, a state environmental director arriving just in time, and the willingness of people on both sides to grow beyond their initial positions towards something wiser and more enduring than either could have created alone. As Blackwell was helped into the car that would take him home, he glanced back one last time at the bronze figures captured in eternal conversation. The auctioneer and the farmer, once adversaries, now partners in a legacy that would continue to shape the land and its people for generations to come. "The land has a memory," he murmured, echoing the words that had become both philosophy and policy in the years since that fateful confrontation. And thanks to Harold, so do we. 35 years after that decisive day at the Westridge County Auction House, a new generation gathered at the Harold Jenkins Center for Agricultural Innovation to celebrate the ongoing impact of what had begun as a simple stand for truth about a watershed. The Innovation Center, built on what had once been contested land, now served as both a working farm and a global training facility where agricultural professionals from around the world came to study the principles of integrated land management that had emerged from the Jenkins-Blackwell collaboration. The celebration marked not just the anniversary of the confrontation, but the publication of a comprehensive new study documenting the quantifiable benefits of the approach in regions worldwide. The research had confirmed what practitioners had long observed. Watersheds protected under Jenkins-Blackwell protocols showed remarkable resilience against climate impacts, and communities practicing its integrated management approach demonstrated greater food security and economic stability through market fluctuations. Dr. Emily Jenkins, now in her 60s and recently appointed as the United Nations Special Envoy for Agricultural Sustainability, stood before the international gathering with quiet pride. The work that her grandfather had begun by simply speaking truth in an auction house had evolved into a framework now implemented in 47 countries across 6 continents. 35 years ago, she told the assembled delegates, an auctioneer, told my grandfather that his outdated farming practices and empty bank account had no place in discussions about the future of agricultural land. Today, those supposedly outdated practices, careful observation, documentation of seasonal patterns, and respect for natural water systems form the core of what we recognize as essential knowledge for responsible land management worldwide. In the audience sat Jason Blackwell, now in his late 50s and chairman of the International Land Stewardship Council. The grandson of Richard Blackwell had carried the family legacy forward, transforming what had begun as a local auction house into a global consultancy specializing in land transitions that honored both economic and ecological values. Most poignant among the attendees were the young farmers from regions where the Jenkins-Blackwell protocols had recently been implemented, places where generations of traditional knowledge had been systematically devalued until this new framework provided mechanisms for its recognition and integration into modern agricultural practice. My community in Karnataka has farmed the same land for 15 generations, explained one young Indian agriculturalist during the panel discussion. The water management techniques my grandmother taught me were dismissed as superstition by commercial interests wanting to purchase our region for industrial agriculture. The Jenkins-Blackwell framework gave us the tools to document this knowledge scientifically and demonstrate its superior outcomes compared to the proposed development models. Similar stories came from farmers in Kenya, Peru, Vietnam, and Ukraine, each testimony reinforcing how a paradigm that began in a small American auction house had provided a structure for communities worldwide to assert the value of their generational wisdom against purely commercial interests. After the formal presentations, attendees gathered in the center's main hall, where an interactive digital display documented the key moments in the evolution of the Jenkins-Blackwell movement. At its center stood a life-sized holographic recreation of the original confrontation. Harold Jenkins standing with his notebook open, Richard Blackwell dismissing him from the auction, and Margaret Jenkins-Cooper arriving with her team to intervene. Watching the recreation, one could see the exact moment when transformation became possible. Not when the authorities arrived, but earlier, when an elderly farmer chose dignity over humiliation, knowledge over silence, and community welfare over personal pride. As visitors interacted with the exhibit, a particularly moving moment occurred when the great-grandchildren of Harold Jenkins and Richard Blackwell, now collaborators on expanding the model to urban agricultural settings, stood together, watching their ancestors' confrontation transform gradually into partnership. "It's strange to think it all could have gone so differently," Laura Jenkins remarked to Michael Blackwell. "If your great-grandfather had listened the first time, or if my great-grandfather hadn't made that phone call, or if your great-aunt hadn't arrived when she did." Michael agreed. "So many moments where a different choice would have created a completely different outcome." The exhibit concluded with a virtual reality experience, allowing visitors to walk the original Oak Ridge Farm property, both as it existed at the time of the auction and as it had evolved over the subsequent decades. The watershed protected, the fields productively maintained, the community prosperity evident in the thriving agricultural enterprises that had developed around it. The day's events concluded with a ceremonial planting of heritage seeds collected from regions worldwide where the Jenkins-Blackwell protocol had been implemented. Symbolic recognition that the principles of integrated knowledge and respect for natural systems transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. As twilight settled over the Innovation Center, Emily Jenkins found a quiet moment to visit the memorial garden where both her grandfather and Richard Blackwell now rested. Beneath simple stones, facing the land they had worked together to protect, The two men who had begun as adversaries had, in their later years, become inseparable companions, often seen walking the fields together, the elderly auctioneer listening intently as the farmer shared observations accumulated over decades. "I think they would be pleased," came a voice behind her. Margaret Jenkins-Cooper, now in her 80s, moved slowly but deliberately to join her daughter at the memorial site. Though her official career had ended years ago, her influence continued through the generation of environmental leaders she had mentored. Not by the recognition, Emily agreed, but by seeing how the land has thrived and the communities with it. "Your grandfather never wanted a movement named after him," the elder Jenkins-Cooper recalled with a smile. "He just wanted the truth about the water to be heard." They stood together in comfortable silence, 3 generations of a family, whose legacy had transformed how societies worldwide valued their relationship with the land. From an elderly farmer defending the truth about a watershed to a global movement for integrated agricultural knowledge, the journey had been remarkable, not for its speed, but for its fundamental recalibration of what constituted value in rural landscapes. As darkness fell completely, lights automatically illuminated the pathways throughout the center, solar-powered systems using energy harvested during the day, a small but significant embodiment of the cyclical thinking at the heart of the Jenkins-Blackwell approach. "The land has a memory," Emily murmured, echoing her grandfather's words that had become a touchstone for the movement worldwide. "And we remember too," her mother completed, the familiar phrase now serving as both philosophy and practical guidance. For land managers globally, behind them, the Innovation Center continued its evening activities, researchers analyzing data from demonstration projects worldwide, farmers sharing experiences across language barriers, economists documenting the long-term financial benefits of integrated stewardship approaches. The work continued, evolving and adapting to new challenges while remaining anchored in the fundamental insight that had emerged from that confrontation 35 years earlier. That land was not merely a commodity to be exploited, but a complex, living system requiring both respect and understanding. As mother and daughter walked back toward the center, their path took them past the bronze statue of Harold Jenkins and Richard Blackwell in eternal conversation. The sculpture, replicated now in agricultural education centers across the world, had become a symbol of how adversaries could become allies when united by respect for something larger than themselves. The land remembered how it had been treated, and through the unlikely partnership that began in conflict but blossomed into collaboration, humanity was learning to remember too. A legacy more enduring than any fortune, more significant than any single auction, more transformative than either man could have imagined on that fateful day when an elderly farmer stood up for the truth about a watershed and changed the course of agricultural history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.